This is a case based in Dunleary, County Dublin. In January 1982, the weather in Ireland was recorded under the category of exceptional weather events. Dublin was particularly badly affected. 26 centimetres of snow fell between the 8th of January and the 13th at Dublin Airport. The temperatures fell below freezing for 8 consecutive days. Soldiers were brought in to de-ice Grafton Street, and the Canadian government donated 6 snowmobiles. In the depths of this extreme weather, few cars were on the road and Dublin would have been quieter than normal. But there was one man that did not let a little snow get in the way of his social life. This man was Charles Self. Charles lived on Brighton Avenue, a by-road just off the Monkstown Road, a very well-to-do area as it still is today. Here he had shared a house with another man named Vincent Hanley, a famous DJ in Ireland at that time, who had moved to London part-time to expand his career. Charles wasn't the kind of man to sit in at night. Pubs, receptions, openings, book launches, you'd find him there. He was embedded in Dublin's social scene and knew many in the entertainment business through his work, and so was well known. Charles, 32 years old, was originally born in England on the 14th of February 1949 and was raised in Scotland. His mother passed away when he was very young, and so his aunt took him in. His father was in the British Army and remarried soon after she died. He worked for the BBC as a set designer when he was headhunted by RTE in Ireland, which is our national TV station. He loved his job, art and music. Charles was also a well-known figure in Dublin's gay world at a time when homosexuality was still illegal, meaning that it wasn't illegal to be gay or be a lesbian, but the act itself was illegal. And so if you were caught, you could be imprisoned. This law dated back to the 1800s when Ireland was ruled by England. You could be sentenced to death for acting on your homosexuality. The law was then amended later to life in prison and lightened again to an unspecified number of years. This law only applied to men, as women were not deemed as being able to perform the act itself. Of course, the Catholic Church also had a big influence in the social acceptance, or the lack of, as it would be. And yet we all know now what these priests were getting up to behind closed doors. The state saw homosexuals as criminals and the church saw them as sinners. It was a very difficult time until it was decriminalised in 1993. Charles was an openly gay man and he lived his life in a non-apologetic way. He frequented the few pubs that were tolerant of gay people. His habitat was the Bailey pub on Duke Street off Grafton Street, the Bartley Duns on Stephen Street Lower, the Hirschfeld Centre in Temple Bar, which was founded in 1979 by the National Gay Federation. It provided Ireland's gay and lesbian community a space where they could feel accepted, supported and meet others like themselves. The centre came to an abrupt end in the autumn of 1987 following a devastating fire, a fire where there was strong evidence to suggest it was started on purpose.
Well, we're standing here outside number 10 Fowne Street Upper, which was the site of the original Hirschfeld Centre in Temple Bar. I opened it on St. Patrick's Day 1979. There wasn't much money around then, and I put all the money into it myself. We had a restaurant, a cinema, a discotheque, a library, counselling rooms, a publishing house. It was a hive of activity. There was nothing else in Temple Bar except the Foggy Jew pub, which is still there, but was only a quarter the size. There was a barber shop, which is still there, and the Project Theatre at the extreme end. But apart from that, there was absolutely nothing else. We ran discos not just for gay people, but also for women's issues, for environmental issues and so on. Brought young people into this area. They saw the possibility. They took short-term leases. They opened up second-hand clothes shops, postcard shops, all this kind of stuff, and they lifted Temple Bar. And so I would claim that number 10 Fowne Street, the Hirschfeld Centre, is what caused Temple Bar. Everything was funded. The one group that never got a single penny was the group that started it, the Hirschfeld Centre. When it was destroyed by fire, I tried to get it going again, but it was impossible. And because it was the start of Temple Bar, I've approached Dublin City Council and asked them, and they have agreed, but they haven't done it yet, to put up a plaque, a blue plaque marking the historical situation, that this was the start of Temple Bar. I would like to see it recognised.
On the afternoon of Wednesday, the 20th of January, Charles was having lunch in the Bailey pub with his friend Bill Maher. They stayed there until nearly 3 p.m. Once they parted ways, Charles went back to work in RTE, having to take the bus as his car was broken down. Later that day after work, Charles went back home at around 8 p.m. and set a fire. He then made his way into the city centre once more. He returned to the Bailey pub and then went on to Bartley Dunn's pub, among other places. At the end of the night, Charles was seen around the toilets on Burgh Quay, which at this time was a well-known cruising area for gay men and where male prostitutes applied their trade. He then took a taxi back to his home in Ainsley Mews and arrived at around 1 a.m. The taxi driver would later say that Charles shared a taxi with a fair-haired man, around 25 years of age, and was wearing a neat two-piece suit and was fairly drunk in the back of the taxi. This person has never been identified. Charles's favourite drink was Blackbush whisky, and his friends would say he was in high spirits that night. He was celebrating a promotion and a pay rise along with it. Almost every night when he came home, Charles would turn on the radio, play music, or watch music videos, and often opened a bottle of wine, and this night was no different, especially as he was thought to have company. But something different happened that night. Charles's life would be taken in the most horrific way. Shortly after 9 a.m. the next morning, Charles's body would be found at the bottom of the stairs by a man that was staying in the house with him, a man named Bertie Tyler. He had been staying in Vincent Hanley's old room while he was away. He was an Englishman who also worked as a designer for RTE. The crime scene itself was one of absolute chaos, with records strewn across the living room and furniture knocked over and moved, and it had been a very loud and violent murder, but yet Bertie would say he heard nothing. It was said that Bertie was in his late 60s and was hard of hearing, and yet the neighbour next door who shared a wall said she did hear screaming in the early hours of that morning. Charles had been stabbed 14 times. There was a slash wound to his throat, a piece of torn ligature around his neck, with the rest tied to a chair, which indicates that he may have been tied up and then escaped to the hallway where he would be found pressed up against the front door. The ligature used was actually a cord from a red dressing gown belonging to Vincent Hanley, the roommate. The then state pathologist John Harbison concluded that Charles had died from stab wounds to the neck and back. Some of the stab wounds were through and through, and the knife used was an 8-inch kitchen knife with a white handle. This to me sounds personal. There is no mention of forensics done on the knife or whether it was recovered or just discovered missing from the knife block. The investigation by Gardaí into Charles's murder was pretty lazy from the start. Once they got a description of the man in the taxi with Charles, their focus was put on the rent boys and the gay community. It was deemed that prejudices were at large in the investigation also. If this had been a straight man that worked for RTE, they would have taken a different route. 1,500 gay men were pulled in to be interviewed. Many did not know Charles and had no information that would progress the investigation. Fingerprints were taken and photographs were taken as the interviews were being conducted. You also need to remember that homosexuality was illegal at this time, and so it was all very intimidating for these men. They knew they were being judged by other straight men in the Garda force. There was no trust as these men were talking to the people that could at the same time arrest them for who they were. Many Gardaí went to these men's work and homes. They were men that were married with children or men who had not come out to their families and friends and were being outed in the most horrific way in connection to a gay man's murder. It was felt by the gay community that Gardaí were building up a database of gay men for future prosecutions, so there was no trust and a lot of fear. It was safe to say that the Gardaí were more focused on this rather than solving a murder. Gardaí were acting on the laws of the state, and while some Gardaí had homophobic tendencies, other Gardaí in Pearse Street in particular were sympathetic to what the gay community were suffering and being put through as a group and as individuals. In response to what the gay community saw as harassment, they organised a protest outside Pearse Street Garda station, and I guess you could call it as Ireland's first gay parade. Bertie, the man staying with Charles and who found his body at the bottom of the stairs, introduced a second man into the mix. He said on the night of the murder a man came into his room and said, "Oh, sorry, wrong room." He described him as having dark curly hair, was well spoken with a West British accent, which did not match the description given by the taxi driver. Again, this man has never been identified. There was some contention when it came to the description that Bertie gave. He provided a sketch of this man that came into his room. He also provided an identikit photograph. These photographs have never been released publicly. Bill Maher, Charles's friend that was with him the day before his murder, said he has seen these sketches and photofit, but Gardaí in the intervening years told him they do not have these items. In February 2017, Gardaí told Bill they did in fact have the sketch as well as the photofit and were making further inquiries. Bill thinks that on that night Charles had met someone, shared a taxi with him, and because they were going in the same direction invited him into his home for a drink, and things got out of hand. Alan Bailey, now retired, was the detective sergeant in charge of the Garda Serious Crime Review team. He presented a paper to the FBI in Virginia in the US about Charles's case, and in particular about what he believes were elements of the crime that were staged. A crime scene is staged to deflect or impede the investigation or deflect from some suspect or another. Charles was found at the bottom of the stairs blocking the front door. It would have made it impossible for the perpetrator to escape out the front door. The presumption was that the killer escaped through the kitchen window. However, there was a planter box on the windowsill, which in the process of someone climbing out a window would have been disturbed or knocked over. It was clear that it was placed on the ground. It wasn't knocked over. There was no spillage whatsoever. It was lifted off the windowsill and placed on the ground. Another big anomaly relates to pools of blood at the scene. There was furniture placed back over the blood. The big thing was, with Charles, it was absolute overkill. His wounds indicated that he was not being killed to be robbed, but it was personal. He was killed to be killed. As 1982 rolled on with no solid leads, the case went cold. Another series of murders would take front page news. A man named Malcolm MacArthur would commit a double murder, a nurse, Bridie Gargan, in the Phoenix Park in Dublin, and a farmer, Donald Dunn, in Edenderry in County Offaly. He had murdered them in cold blood and later arrested for these murders at the Attorney General's house in Dalkey in County Dublin. MacArthur was known on the gay scene in Dublin as well as to Charles. Some friends of Charles said they saw a similarity between the description of the person Bertie said came into his room to MacArthur. MacArthur did admit that he frequented Bartley Dunn's, but stopped around the time of Charles's murder. Bill, Charles's friend, said he was told by a reporter that his source told him Charles's killer was in prison. This source was a Garda. There is another peculiar aspect to Charles's death. 14 years after the death of Charles, the man who had hired him at RTE left his home in Sandymount. Neither he nor his car have ever been found. There were also two other high-profile killings of gay men in 1982. On the 8th of September, John Roach, a 29-year-old hotel porter who worked in the Munster Hotel in Cork, was stabbed to death in what was deemed a homophobic killing. The man was brought to trial, and using the gay panic defence, he was acquitted of murder and found guilty of manslaughter. The day after, on the 9th of September, Declan Flynn, which is a case I have covered, was a gay man who worked for Éireannta. He was attacked and beaten to death by 5 men in Dublin's Fairview Park, a known gay meeting point where a number of other homophobic attacks had occurred before Declan's death. In March 1983, after Declan's killers were given a suspended sentence and walked free, protests took place in Dublin, a public expression of anger by the gay community supported by some of the public, while the perpetrators celebrated publicly and again supported by some of the public, which disgusts me even having to tell this side of Irish society in the 80s. What really stood out to me covering the Declan Flynn case was the attitude of the judge. He made several vile comments including, "This could not be deemed as murder." In other words, a homosexual act at that time was seen as more criminal than taking a life. There are many theories, and other men were seen in Charles's company that night. Witnesses came forward saying that Charles was in the company of a young man carrying a duffel bag and in his mid-20s. On Burgh Quay, he met 2 men in their late 20s, one who had dark hair and wore a leather jacket. Then there was a man in Brighton Lane. He had short brown hair and was wearing a tweed beige jacket and dark trousers. A neighbour said she saw a fairly tall man in dark clothes jump over the wall of the mews. In 2008, one of the first cases to be reviewed by the Cold Case Review team was indeed Charles's case. and it showed how the Gardaí failed Charles and his family. Many public appeals have been done in the years since, but as of 2025, this case remains unsolved. It has now been 43 years. Each of the 1,500 people interviewed had a Garda file opened. To this day, the authorities have refused to return them. Cathal Kerrigan, a Cork gay activist, has sought access to his file on several occasions, only to come up against a brick wall. Things have changed in Ireland, but perhaps not to the extent we would like to believe, he said. Bertie, who found Charles, died in December 1995 at the age of 80. As of 2025, this case is still open today. Rest in peace, Charles.
Homosexuality, as heterosexuality, is something that is based on mutuality itself. It is a response of individuals to each other, based on understanding, love, and everything else. Just the same as heterosexuality, where a boy meets girl. It is not a situation where a boy meets a girl and has to lure her with pearls or something like that and seduce her off up a dark alleyway. I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous. The same too with homosexuality. It is not a situation where homosexuals themselves are a mass of deviants who roam around the streets spotting people alone and saying, ah, yes, I have it now, and rush in and saying, lovely. You know, it is not like that at all. It's totally ludicrous.
Would you say yourself, from having met us and seen us, that we either behave or look like base seducers? Or is that a loaded question?
No, it's not a loaded question. Of course I'll answer it. No, you don't. But let me say this to you. I, of course, like everybody else who is not homosexual, has preconceived ideas, as Jimmy has said. I would have thought that most homosexuals would be camp, prancing queens.
Yeah. Well, some people are, but some heterosexual people are effeminate, and I think the main way we assuage society's fears is by being ourselves and saying, well, part of our personality is that we're homosexual. But it's only part of our part of our personalities, and here we are. People have got away with this idea about us because we haven't been visible before.